All right, let's see if I remember how to make a tier list, because it has been a while. So if we take a look at the meta here, got Ash LeBlanc, Karmaset, yada yada. We got a lot of decks that are hovering at above a 50% win rate, and I'm going to, probably the best way for me to do this actually, to pull this up, because I think I have a good idea of how I feel about things. So if this circle is the meta, right, then I want to say that a good percent of it, probably like 60%, we have like just mid-range decks. Demacia-esque mid-range decks, right? And a lot of those decks, for the most part, lose to Ash decks, right? And that's like sort of the baseline of your meta. Maybe calling the mid-range section this big is a little unfair, but hey, the proportions aren't perfect. But essentially a bulk of the meta is going to be mid-range. Those mid-range decks are supposed to be losing to Ash, which is why we have Ash as the number one deck for the first time in who knows how long. And then over on the side, we have like, there's really not a lot of what people I think would call aggro decks. A lot of them are leaning more towards mid-range, which makes sense because we lost Decimate. So I think the aggro decks are really just kind of getting enveloped under the mid-range blanket, and there's very few decks that you would actually get multiple people to agree on are aggro. And then as our last section, we kind of have like things that dirtle. The Karma decks, the Seraphine decks, the Annie, Caitlyn decks kinds of things. And instead of a triangle meta, it feels like we're kind of looking more like a square, because I'm not really sure how some of these interact with each other. And obviously, on one section, we have the mid-range decks, and those mid-range decks are going to be losing to Ash decks. And so, Ash must be tier 1. Right, I think that's pretty agreeable. Maybe the tournament meta will play out in a different way, and Ash LeBlanc is a little bit too streamlined and just will not be able to actually hold up in a tournament environment. That wouldn't surprise me too much. But for the opening weekend, I think it's fair to call Ash tier 1, especially for something like the Mastering Runeterra Open, where you're going to be getting a lot of players who aren't necessarily of the highest caliber, that are just getting back into Runeterra because of rotation and want to just sort of explore things. So we'll say, it's been so long since I've typed these words. Frostbite midrange tier 1 samples. Believe Runeterra AR samples, yeah, still are not working. So what I'm going to do after I finish recording, before I actually publish the tier list, is I'm going to go on ladder, and I'm just going to find the highest ranked player playing that deck, copy their list, put it in the sample section. That's where the samples are coming from, okay? So then, if this is true, you know, sort of one of the big questions, if mid-range is this much of the meta, is how are the mid-range decks interacting with each other? And the answer is, whoever goes the biggest is winning. And from my understanding, the biggest mid-range decks are going to be Deep, because it's really hard to get bigger than a Nautilus, and Aatrox Vein, because it's also hard to get bigger than an Aatrox. And so I think these are the two sort of kings of mid-range right now, and so I think if you wanted to find what a level 1 lineup is, level 1 being sort of the baseline expectation where you build your foundation off of in terms of counter picks and beating things, I think your standardized lineup, and I'm not even sure how popular of a lineup this is going to be, should be Deep, Aatrox Vein, and Frostbite midrange. Right, that's going to give you a lot of game into the majority of this mid-range focused meta, while still being large enough, while low to the ground enough, that you can take out some of the dirtily decks with some good hands. I think this is sort of the level 1 that we're looking at. This is the baseline expectation for the meta. And so I think it'd be fair to say that all of these decks belong in tier 1. That said, I think that you are going to see a lot more decks than you're kind of used to on my tier list being in tier 1, and part of that is how close together the power level of everything feels. I could either pick the best deck or two, put those in tier 1, so like let's say the best one from each archetype, so we'll put like Frostbite midrange tier 1, you know, like Jack Seraphine tier 1, and then fill out everything else with tier 2, but I feel like everything is close enough in power level that it would be fair to just put everything in tier 1, and really what we're kind of doing here is making sure that we have a solid foundation where we don't have to change everything going into the Runeterra Open next week. And I'm going to have a much better idea of what the meta actually looks like once I get done casting the Mastering Runeterra Open this weekend. And that's one of the reasons that I love being able to cast the Mastering Runeterra stuff, is because it does give me a bird's eye view on what the meta looks like, and it forces me to pay attention to it. Because trust me, I like casting. I don't necessarily love watching tournaments when I'm not casting because, that's what I do with all of my free time already. I'm not so passionate about it that I'm also nose to the grindstone on these, just so that I can put out a YouTube video for a Runeterra Open. If I was casting the Runeterra Open, yeah, I'd be watching these anyway, but I'm not. So if we take a look at, like, Gwen Quinn, I think would be tier 2. If we're just kind of looking at other mid-range decks that I don't think necessarily belong in tier 1, Lurk doesn't go on the fucking tier list. Jack Seraphine would be tier 1. Aatrox King would be tier 2. I think you should just play Aatrox Vayne. Yeah, like here we see Aatrox Twin Vayne with about 4 percentage points over on this. Annie Caitlyn I'm not big on. This I'd probably put in tier 2. I think it's one of the worst Dirtily decks, and I don't think it beats the other Dirtily decks. Like, I don't think Annie Caitlyn is beating Jack Seraphine or Karma Set. But I do think you would probably include it if you wanted to go a full Dirtle lineup. You'd probably be on Karma Set, Jack Seraphine, and then Annie Caitlyn is your last one. It's because it's Ionia PNZ, Billswater PNZ, and then Noxus PNZ, so you have no regional or champion overlap. Echo Jinx, probably down in like tier 3. I don't really know where this fits into a lineup, and I think that people will probably top with it. I think it still belongs on the tier list. Malphite Talia actually is interesting as well, because when we talk about these mid-range decks going very tall and how deep and Vayne Aatrox are probably your best bets, that is excluding Talia Malphite, which I don't think I should do. I do think that Talia Malphite has a place, and I'm not sure if it's tier 1 or if it's tier 2. I think the high win rate can still be attributed to, first of all, just a low play rate, so only like the purists are playing it. Like Grandpa Roji's probably pumping these numbers on ladder right now, but also I think people just don't really know how to play against it, or they're not sure what is in the deck. I think the Celestial Wonder can really catch people off guard. Sunburst, things that weren't necessarily in the original Talia Malphite list. So I think part of this might just be the closed deckless nature of ladder, and so I would stick Talia Malphite probably in tier 2. And then I got to figure out where I feel about the aggro decks, the Samira decks. By aggro decks, I think I just mean like things that play a lot of 1-drops, and I don't even know how many Fizz Samira plays, but I haven't heard much about this deck for the last couple of days. In fact, I would love to ban the phrase Twisted Fate Fizz from Twitter for the first 72 hours after a meta drops, because comparing this deck to TF Fizz was so ignorant, and people did it anyway, and now it's not even the best Samira variant on ladder, so whatever. But I do need to figure out where these actually sort of fall in, because Fizz Samira is not a mid-range deck. Leona Samira is more of a mid-range deck, but like, you gotta get up real early in the morning to look me in the eye, put Legion Saboteur, Precious Pet, and Noxian Fervor in your deck and sell me that this is a mid-range deck, right? I think this is much more leaning towards the aggro side of things. And I don't think I like aggro for the tournament environment right now. I think that aggro players are getting away with a lot because people are really trying to dirtle on ladder. And I think that in tournament, the players that are willing to play the Dirtle decks play them a lot better than your average ladder player and do have more room to punish you. Can you still run them over? Absolutely. But I don't think we're putting a Samira deck in tier 1 per se. I don't think you're going to get a Samira deck in every lineup, or even in like half of the lineups necessarily within the top 8. And I could be wrong on that. And there's always like at least one thing where I very well could be wrong, and I think I might be wrong about Samira this week. And that might be really obvious to everyone else. Obviously, it's not obvious to me, or I wouldn't be saying it. But yeah, I don't think Samira has a tier 1 deck right now. I think that this ladder win rate is looking very good, but when it comes to the tournament environment, I don't think you're going to hold up on that. But maybe you do. Maybe this is actually one of the other decks that you line up your mid-range lineup with, and you go Leona Samira as opposed to either Deep or Aatrox Vayne. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's where we are right now. Maybe we'll get there by the Runeterra Open, but I don't think that's where we are right now. So I think we're looking at Frostbite mid-range, we're looking at Deep, we're looking at Aatrox Vayne, we're looking at Karma Set, and we're looking at Jack Seraphine. I think these are the tier 1 decks. And obviously ladder disagrees with me on that, which is understandable. And then when we get into tier 2, I think that's where you kind of get, the real question is like, what is tier 3? Tier 3 is going to be reserved for like counter picks that you necessarily shouldn't be getting into near like this close to the opening weekend. So that's probably what tier 3 is going to be. But again, I haven't done a tier list in a while, so this might be a little rough on the eyes here. But I thought I'd show you guys sort of the process of how I do these as well, because some of it is just intuition, and sometimes that intuition works out well, and sometimes it doesn't, but it does work out well, a lot more than it doesn't work out, which is why I'm good at this and why you watch these videos, right? So then we have Aatrox Demacia, Ionia Piltover and Zon, and then Bilgewater Piltover and Zon. For what it's worth, I probably wouldn't run a fully dedicated archetypal lineup. I've been playing a lot of Jack Seraphine. I think that deck's very good. I think it has game into everything. I think Karma's Set probably in a similar fashion, although Karma's Set I think is a little bit more focused on beating mid-range than Jack Seraphine is. Karma Set having the recalls and the stuns definitely gives it more game against the larger units. On top of the fact that they have, I mean, it really is just as the recalls, right? Because the top end of removal for Jack Seraphine is going to be Hexbliterator unless you can get kegs. And honestly, Jack Seraphine's place in the meta and what it's doing so well is it really forces you to have keg interaction. And I think that's why the Samira decks aren't doing as well, even into dirtily stuff as they want to, is a keg plus a board wipe is going to wipe the board of a Samira player. You do not have enough tools to hit a keg and while still playing aggressively to really equalize here. And so I think like Jack Seraphine is a big pressure point on the meta for these aggressive decks coming into a tournament setting where we tend to see more Seraphine than we do on ladder, right? So then down in tier 2, I think that's where I would put all of my Samira decks. Although I think going based purely off of ladder on this and just what I've seen lately, like it does surprise me that Fizz Samira, actually, yeah, for the last 2 days, like it's wild to me that Fizz Samira is still the number 3 deck across all on ladder because I haven't really seen much Fizz Samira and I've been playing ladder for the last few days. I've seen a lot more Leona Samira. So because we can only have one Samira deck in a tier, I think I would put Leona Samira here and I would put Fizz Samira here. And that might look really stupid to you. And I might end up looking really stupid when the weekend's over, but part of making tier lists is having the balls to call your shot. So I'm calling my shot, and that's what it looks like, and history will determine whether or not that was right. Gwen, who do you play with Gwen again? It's Quinn? Yeah, Quinn. Surprised it's not Vayne, but they do seem to really like taking advantage of the scout attack with Opulent Foyer. Seems to be the big gimmick of this deck. So that's what? Leona Samira, Lurk, ignore that. Aatrox is probably down in tier 3. I still think that the Demacia version is a lot better. I don't really know why you would be running this variant instead. I'll probably put it... Again, I'm going to grab whoever the highest ranked Aatrox Vayne player is on ladder. I think it's Seku, unless Seku was running Thralls and I'm misremembering. But that's kind of where I'm just going to grab it from. I'm going to leave it as Aatrox Vayne even if it has a Quinn in it. Annie Caitlyn feels really bad to me, to be honest. I'm pretty down on this deck. And that just is what it is. It's my tier list. I get to be down on decks sometimes. Caitlyn Teemo, I'm not justifying here. Echo Jinx, I think you can make an argument for existing. I don't think it's great. Tillia Malphite, I definitely think, if not tier 1, tier 2. I think tier 2 is a fine place for it, but I could see arguments for tier 1. Alawi Swain, it feels worse than it should. Like, I feel like this deck should be better. And I'm kind of debating on where I do feel like it belongs on a tier list. Losing Whispered Words did hurt a bit. Like, yeah, obviously you still have Salvage. It's not that big of a difference. But I don't know. I really haven't been impressed by this list. I don't think you're aggressive enough to beat the dirtily stuff. And I don't think you're really getting bigger than things like Deep or Tillia Malphite or Aatrox Vayne fast enough for it to matter. And so I think Alawi Swain, like a lot of Swain decks in the past, might just be a bait, but I do still think it belongs on the tier list. Elites, yeah, Elites probably tier 3. Is there anything else that can convince me it's tier 2? Caitlyn Jace? Oh, maybe Nora Vygar? Yeah, I think Nora Vygar might convince me it's tier 2. Hold on, because what are you doing here? You've got some decent ping tools against aggro, but I think we are looking at big mid-range and dirtle decks. And I think between Vygar and, yeah, I think you can beat the dirtle decks. I don't know how hard you can, like, out-dirtle something like Karma Set or Jack Seraphine, but maybe Nora Vygar is the third one. Maybe that's the third dirtle deck in the lineup. And then now we're really getting down here, and I'm just kind of looking to see if there's anything I've forgotten. Not looking at things with, like, low play rates and high win rates, but there was a Varus Riven deck that's, like, number 3 on ladder. I don't know if they shot up there in the early days and have just been camping, so... But, yeah, it doesn't really look like much else is doing anything crazy keep an eye on this. Again, I still haven't fully digested like what has and hasn't rotated. I honestly did not know that Pantheon was still in the game. Yeah, Viego's really just not doing great either, huh? I know Set Viego was the big Viego deck, or the big set deck rather, for like the Glory and Navori Brawl. But okay, yeah, this is what I was looking for. I think was Riven, Samira, Varus. I haven't been impressed by this deck. I haven't really been struggling with it, but I do think it has a place on the tier list. But if there's no Samira deck in tier 1, I guess we just put it in tier 3 and say, hey, if this is the flavor of Samira that you would prefer to go for. It's got a really high win rate. It's got a really low play rate. I really just don't think it's going to show up this weekend. Like, I don't think a lot of players are looking at this as like, hey, yeah, this is, you know, how we should be running this list. I don't think it's going to be very popular, and so I think its top 8 representation is going to be gatekept by that. Even if this was like actually the best deck in the format, I don't think you've got 8 players in the tournament on this. It was, and Riven, yeah. I think that was the last deck that I had in mind that I wanted to make sure I got on the tier list. So yeah, these are where I've got everything right now. I think I kind of talked through the explanation, so now I am going to get the samples in here, fill out the regional composition, throw this on the website, throw this on Twitter, get the video out, all that good stuff. So thank you so much for watching. I've been Boulevard. This has been the reconstruction of the tier list from scratch. And hopefully we get some good games out this weekend. We can get a much better idea of what things look like going into the Runeterra Open. But this is kind of where I'm feeling for day 1. I don't think there's anything crazy that I'm forgetting, but there always is something I'm forgetting. There's a lot of decks out there. Even for like a preliminary tier list, this is what, like 18 decks? 16 decks, because I think it counts tier 2 and tier 3. Yeah, that feels like a lot. So this is where I'm settled for now. Good luck to everybody competing in the Mastering Runeterra Open this weekend. I will have a sign up for that in the description below. I believe there is an entry fee, but it's like $1,000 prize pool, so you might as well get in there. Or if you don't want to, you can come watch me and Ice-T do our casting on it and just get a good idea of what to expect next weekend at the Runeterra Open. So thank you so much for watching. I've been Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.